Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to the new Evangelicals podcast. I hope you are doing well. This is going to be, for some people, maybe a pretty intense episode, and that's okay. I interviewed Justin Oberste, who is a therapist. He is someone who's in the queer community, and he shared his story attending Bob Jones University. And we also got into therapy, and we talked a lot about sex therapy. Now, I want to warn you, we do talk about pornography, and we might, by we, I really mean Justin, might land in some places that you as the listener might feel uncomfortable with. That is okay. We are allowed to listen to other perspectives and disagree with people. Part of why I bring on such a diverse group of guests is so you are exposed to how people think and to other ways of living as a human. Justin is also trained in this area, and so I really appreciated him talking about that and talking about just how purity culture can be so harmful and what sexual liberation looks like. That being said, if you are someone who has suffered from abuse or sexual abuse, just be forewarned, we do talk about topics that are sexual in nature on this episode. That being said, friends, I want to say thank you to everyone who continues to listen and share the podcast. I mean, we're coming up on the year mark of the podcast, had no clue what it was going to turn into, and I'm just honored to have you here. Thank you. If you can give us a rating and review, it always helps us. And if you like the work that we do, we are totally crowdfunded. We do nothing behind paywalls. Everything that we're able to do is because the community helps to fund the work that we do. If you want to give, you can click on the link in the show notes below. It would go so far. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, friends, without further ado, here is my episode with Justin. I hope you enjoy it. Well, Justin Oberste, it is great to meet you. Actually, you have your PhD, so I think I should say Dr. Justin Oberste. Thank you for being on the show.
I don't have a PhD. It's okay.
What? I thought that's what it said. Oh, I misread it. I'm sorry. Let's try it again. One more time. No, it says PhD.
You're good, you're good. Where?
Oh, wait, Chris Donahue, PhD?
Oh, yeah, that's my supervisor. Yeah.
I apologize. I misread.
No, you're good. You're good. I have a master's. PhD is on the horizon.
Cool. That's awesome. All right. One more time from the top. My producer will edit this out.
That's great.
Justin, thank you for making time to be on the New Evangelicals podcast. I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule and also in the middle of an atmospheric event, which is happening in California. So thanks for being here.
It's good to be here.
So you reached out to me maybe a few weeks ago and we're like, hey, we'd love to come on the show and talk. And I checked out your Instagram and did some research. I'm like, yes, it'd be great to have you on the show. So why don't we start, for our audience sake, why don't you kind of give us like the big picture story of who Justin is, and then we'll dig into all the good stuff.
Yeah, gosh, great question. I am a cisgender male. I grew up in the South. So I'm from a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. And born and raised there, moved to Greenville, South Carolina for college. And I went to a very ultra conservative Christian college, which we'll get into, and lived there for probably about 16 years, and then moved to Los Angeles about 3 years ago, pursuing grad school, completing that. And then now I have landed in Santa Barbara, California.
Wow. Awesome.
Where I am an associate therapist.
Okay. So you work in the realm of therapy, which is great.
Yeah.
So did you grow up evangelical? I mean, you're in the South, the Bible Belt. What was it like growing up for you?
Yeah, a plethora. I mean, I was raised Catholic.
Okay.
And then went to Southern Baptist.
Okay.
And then went to Independent Baptist.
Okay.
And then went to a non-denominational fundamental Baptist college.
Okay.
And then went to more of an evangelical route after that, which was more of like a Joshua Harris Sovereign Grace.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. So you've had all the flavors of like fundamentalist Christianity, really.
Oh, yeah.
And what was that like growing up for you in those spaces? Like, were you always kind of a committed Christian as you went through your teenage years? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, I just, would go. I found it interesting. I think I had a first not conversion therapy. That's later. A moment where I maybe gave my life to God when I was 9, when I was more in the Southern Baptist circle. But then I would say high school, I went to a Christian high school. That's when I would say I got saved.
Okay.
And that's a whole nother thing. But that's when I more or less got more dedicated to Christianity. Like, I need to go to a Christian college. I need to train. I need to know the Bible. I need to be some sort of evangelist,
Yeah.
preacher, teacher. So that's when I became a little bit more diehard, drank a lot of the Kool-Aid. It was later in my teens and then 20s.
Okay. So at this point, are you thinking like, oh, I'm going to go into ministry. I'm going to become a pastor one day. Like, what were you thinking, like, career wise? Because a lot of times when we're in those teenage years, right, we're told by our society, start thinking about what you want to do for a living. And
Totally.
similar to you, I was very committed to Jesus through my teenage years. And I certainly entertained, being in some form of ministry. What was that like for you?
Gosh, it was great in a sense, because I was really at a point in my life almost going into Christian college where I was like, what do I do? I have no direction. And so my senior trip was at this camp called the Wilds Christian Camp.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Are you familiar with that at all,
I'm
Tim?
not.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're
This is
gonna unpack
good.
that. I'm writing that one down.
Yes.
All right.
So I went, and they had an evangelist speaking at one of the closing nights of this week-long kind of Christian retreat for seniors. And
Okay.
I was absolutely scared into the ministry, to be quite honest.
Interesting.
Like, if you don't get into the ministry, you're not dedicated to God. You need to take this seriously. So I did. I was like, okay, I need to be in ministry, I guess. And I guess along the way, people in my life said, I was good at speaking, or I was, warm and friendly. So yeah, you would do great as an evangelist or missionary or something like that. So that's when I kind of was like, okay, this must be the direction for me. So when I went to Bob Jones University, which was the Christian college I went to, that's what I pursued.
Okay. Now
out of fear.
You just said one of the words, or one of the phrases that makes our audience, they pay attention. Wait, Bob Jones University,
Yes.
most of them are probably aware of what that college is about. I mean, I've covered Bob Jones himself pretty extensively. I brought up some of their major problems. What was it like for you being in this environment? Because Bob Jones is very, they're Pensacola level as far as how strict they are. What was that like for you?
I love you just mentioned Pensacola. A lot of people don't know about that either.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the difference, I'll tell the audience, the difference is translation of the Bible in that sense. Pensacola is very King James only. That was kind of what it separated from. And then Bob Jones was more open to other translations of the Bible.
Okay.
But very similar as far as morals or ethics, they would say, dress codes, women in skirts, really no makeup.
Right.
Very attractive. So but Bob Jones was kind of one of those schools. I had gone there a few times for actually when I was younger for basketball camp. I played college basketball. So I went there, and I remember thinking then, it's not strict like you would see, while you're there for a semester. But I remember thinking, like, these people are kind of strange. But when I was really, I'll say, scared into the ministry, Bob Jones was appealing from a conservative standpoint because it had more of a liberal arts education.
Yes.
So that pulled me in. I was like, because I also am an artist. I paint. And I was like, that would be kind of cool. So I pursued it that way. But when I got there, Tim, I had no clue, honestly, how strict it was. I remember my first day in the dorms, and they have separate dorms, guys and girls, and on separate sides of campus.
Of course.
When I was in the dorm room, I was blasting Alanis Morissette. I had her albums. I mean, I didn't grow up.
You were in trouble.
People came running in the room. They're like, what is this? You can't have this. And they took my CDs. And I was like, why can't I have this? I had no clue going into it. And I had two senior roommates. So they were very, used to the rules and subscribed to it. And I was just like, why do I have to make my bed every morning at 6:30? Why do they have room check? Why do my shoes need to be in a certain place, in the room in my desk? And why do they get to go through my things?
Wait, I'm sorry. Did you just say that at every morning at 6:30 in the morning, you had to have your bed made? Like, you couldn't sleep in?
No, they had on weekends you could, because that's okay.
Till what, 7:30?
Yeah, for real. They changed it my sophomore year. They stopped doing that. But yeah, my first year we were up at 6:30 every morning except weekends, and they had what they called room checks. So they come in and check your room, make sure it's clean, your bed's made, shoes and clothes are organized, desk is attractive.
And what year is this? Like what you were talking about here?
2002, 2003.
Okay, so
Yeah, that's when I
you're at
started.
Bob Jones University 2 years after they overturned their interracial dating ban, because they overturned it
Oh
in the year
yeah.
2000. So, but you're fresh. You're pretty close to when
Oh
that ban was
yeah.
overturned. So so it was still very, wow. I mean, I can't imagine going to a college, paying all this money, only to be told that every morning at 6:30 in the morning I have to be up and my bed has to be made. It sounds more like the military than the college.
It is. It's very kind of boot camp. I remember telling different friends outside of the school and family members, like, dude, is this like a military base? And I didn't even think much of it. I was like, yeah, I guess it kind of is. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so you're at Bob Jones. You're attracted to this school because they have a liberal arts program where I guess you're able to paint churches and Bibles, essentially, right? But
And
so
cherubs. Yeah.
yeah, and cherubs, of course. So what was the degree you were pursuing at Bob Jones University? Was it a liberal arts education? Was it theology? Like, what were you going for?
Yeah. I was doing more of a theology, but my minor was in art. And I was actually really attracted to interior design too.
Oh, nice.
But I wasn't allowed to study interior design because I was a man. Yeah.
Wow.
So it was only for women at that time. I think
Okay.
that's changed, maybe, who knows.
Who
But
knows?
at the time that was why. But I stuck with more of a theological base and changed it a little bit to maybe more of a missionary focus or evangelical focus.
Mhm.
And it just I didn't like it. I mean, I was having a really difficult time. I wasn't close to any of the teachers. They weren't very warm
Mm,
and friendly.
mm.
But actually, in the art department, the art teachers at Bob Jones were warm and friendly. So I really kind of poured myself more into my minor. And actually,
Okay.
my minor doing art classes is what actually helped my GPA because I was not
Wow.
doing well in the Bible classes.
Right. Fair enough. All right. So
Yeah.
we are going to progress your story, but I want to go back just for a few minutes back to this Wilds Christian camp that you mentioned.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, your face kind of lit up when we talked about it. So you said it was there on a senior trip that you were really kind of scared into going into ministry, right? Like, hey, if you don't go, you're not in God's will. I mean, we most of the
Yeah.
audience that listens to us has grown up in evangelical circles, so we can all think back to a moment where someone, quote unquote, prophesied over us, or in more fundamental
Mhm.
circles, they just told us what to do. And it's because if we don't do it, we're outside of God's will. What was that? Was that your only time at that camp just for that 1 week? Did you go yearly? What's your relationship to Wild Christian Camp?
Oh man, that's a good. I ended up working for them.
You did.
Yeah, I spent 2 summers there as a camp counselor during the
While you were at
summers
BJU, Bob Jones?
while I was at BJU, and I so that was quite an experience. It's actually in a beautiful place. It's
Yeah,
in close to Brevard, North Carolina, hidden up in the mountains there.
sure.
But my experience there still, I'm a gay man. I identify more as queer, but as a closeted LGBTQ person, it was terrifying for me
Hmm.
because that's where I felt more pressure because you're getting these different campers, all age groups that are probably LGBTQ themselves, and you're noticing things or they're telling you about pornography they viewed and different sins in their life. And here I am, this closeted person trying to tell them about Jesus and he'll fix all their problems. It
Hmm.
was really traumatic for me during those summers. I will say that, and trying to
Yeah.
remain closeted and trying to
Right.
figure out who I am. But
Right.
during that experience, I met probably, I would say, a soulmate of mine, one of my closest friends. And she was a daughter of one of the leaders of that camp. But I met her then and just, we're still best friends now. And she's
Hmm.
actually on a very similar journey to me and
Hmm.
wanting to kind of step back into these spaces,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
deconstruction world,
Sure.
and trying to help heal
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
trauma that a lot of these institutions cause. But the Wilds was yeah, you're just basically evangelizing church kids.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you bring up how you met that person who you defined, as kind of a soulmate person. I think that a lot of us through processing all of our own church upbringing and trauma, we do have those people in our lives that despite all of the hurt, we're grateful that we were able to meet them, you know, at that time in life, right? So like, yeah, maybe I wouldn't want to go back to how I grew up. However, I have met some friends in some of these ministries I was a part of. I was a part of one called Child Evangelism Fellowship. It's a big ministry aimed at kids. They're one of the biggest in the world. And while I'm certainly not proud maybe now of like what I did, proselytizing all the time, I have met friends who I'm still close to today, who have went on similar journeys or who have gotten their doctorate in theology, and I consider them close friends. And I'm grateful for those friendships, despite maybe the situation not being ideal.
Yeah, totally. It helps it all make sense.
Yes, it does. All right. So right now in the story, we have how you grew up. You're at Bob Jones University, and then regarding you said that you identify more as queer, right? Is what you said at this point. When did you start coming to that realization that, hey, okay, I might be queer? Like, how did that play a role into your church life as you were growing up?
Gosh, great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, these are good. It's so nice to be able to kind of talk about this on this type of a platform, because I'm finally now being able to use my voice.
Yeah.
It's refreshing, but I was more aware of it in my early teens,
Okay.
of being attracted to same sex, but it really came more into fruition at Bob Jones while I was in the men's dorms. Everyone's walking around in just a towel or something. And I was in various leadership positions. And there was one particular year where I was what they called like a prayer captain, prayer leader. And so I kind of was the spiritual leader over a certain hall and rooms. So, and I happened to have really attractive guys that year on my hall.
Yeah.
And this inner struggle, because at that time I believed it was wrong. Like this is some sort of a sin, that I apparently did something wrong maybe when I was younger, and God gave me over to this mind. So that's kind of was my belief at the time. So I actually left. I withdrew. It got so overwhelming for me, and the negative thinking, all of that. So I withdrew, went back home, told my parents what was going on. But I kind of worded it with, I'm afraid I might be gay and I need to fix this.
Yes.
And they didn't know what to do either. They more or less listened to me. So that's when I actually went back to the wilds and worked full time, kind of as part of maintenance crew, and did landscaping and did all that, because it just to me was a place to go and just make a little bit of money while I figure out what I'm going to do next.
Right.
And while I was there, I spoke to one of the leaders about maybe being same-sex attracted, and they directed me to what I didn't know at the time it was called that, but conversion therapy. So I left there from working for a brief period and started doing conversion therapy. It was a program actually out of Kentucky that was associated with Exodus, but kind of like its own little thing though too, called Pure Life Ministries. Okay. And so I did that for about 6 months, and it was more of a kind of an online thing, kind of like this, where I would call in, do readings, write papers, all of that. And during that time, when I completed that, this is funny too, I actually went to another Christian college. I actually was trying to go somewhere else besides Bob Jones, this little school in Knoxville, Tennessee called Crown College. Okay. Are you familiar with that at all?
I am not familiar with Crown College.
That's another story for another time. But there, I got really involved. It looked like all my credits were going to transfer from Bob Jones. Actually made the college basketball team. They were in the NCCAA. Wow. So I was like, okay, this is cool. Some good motivation. Yeah. But then after I made the team and started traveling, they came back to me and said, actually, your credits aren't going to transfer because we believe differently about the Bible than Bob Jones does. So you're going to have to start as a freshman instead of a junior. So
that's the whole reason your credits wouldn't transfer, just because they see the Bible differently?
Yes. So left there. I went back to Georgia, lived with my parents, and got a job, just a regular job, just to make some money to figure out, well, how I need a college degree. Like, what am I going to do? Right. So I looked at state schools. State schools, of course, were like, you basically have to start over. What is the Bible? Right. Bob Jones, what? So it was so frustrating, Tim. So I basically was like, I have to go back. I have to go back and finish.
To Bob Jones.
To Bob Jones. So I was 22. I know I was 22 or 23 at the time. So their rules are you can live off campus by yourself at a certain age. So I had just passed that age gap. Right. So I went back, got my own apartment, lived in town, worked at a local YMCA, and finished at Bob Jones. And dated some girls. because, I had just done some conversion therapy, but then I
Right.
realized
You
while
were converted,
I
quote
telling
unquote.
you, and then
Oh my
realized while
God.
that was happening, it wasn't working. So
Yeah.
I did another conversion therapy organization down in Gainesville, Florida, which had it was a little bit more manipulative, where it was like, it's okay to be same-sex attracted. You just can't act on it. And in a sense, kind of bringing in the Kinsey Scale, which I don't know if you're familiar with, where
I'm
it's a
I'm
scale
not
of
sure if the
attraction.
audience is either. If you can describe that really
Okay.
quick.
Yeah, it just was developed in the 50s and 60s. Kinsey man
Okay.
realized by just testing thousands of people that everyone has different levels of attraction. There's not just one thing. You don't
Oh,
just fit on one side. So it's kind of more fluid, your
okay.
attraction. So this type of conversion therapy was like, yeah, it's okay to be same-sex attracted. You just can't act on it. It makes sense. There's such thing as liking both, men and women, which we call bisexuality.
Right.
But you just need to be married to a girl and all of that. So, and there were other things they used that was more kind of John Eldridge, Wild at Heart
Oh
type
yeah. I'm
stuff.
familiar with
Yeah,
John Eldridge.
yeah. Which I would bring in more of that toxic kind of masculinity
Yeah.
lens to all of that. So I
Yeah.
left that feeling kind of the same, but like maybe there's something to it. But as soon as I came back to Greenville, was finishing up at Bob Jones, I met a guy that just rocked my world,
At
fell
Bob
in love
Jones.
with. He went to Bob Jones, but he wasn't a student at the time. He'd already
Okay.
graduated. So ex
Gotcha.
Bob Jones.
Wow.
So that's when it just kind of went downhill in the sense from that world. Just like, I love this guy. I moved in with him. I graduated from Bob Jones, and then, got a job locally and just tried to figure out he was just my roommate at the time, but
Oh,
like,
of course.
how does this work?
Right.
I'm in
So,
love. It feels great, but I can't
right.
tell anyone.
Right. And did you, at this point in your journey, were you conflicted with that? Like, oh, this is wrong still? Or were you just like, no, this is who I am. I'm embracing it. I'm not going to feel guilty about having these feelings. Or was that conversion therapy still like, did that therapy still have a place in your mind of, no, I shouldn't do this. It's not God honoring or something like that?
Gosh, that's such a good question. It's funny. It relates to actually this mug that I'm holding, which is kind of surreal. I'm getting chill bumps just thinking about. But my last semester at Bob Jones, I took a ceramic class as an elective.
Okay.
And this ties into this question.
Yeah, go for it.
Perfect.
Cool.
So this mug kind of ties into this question, where I made this mug out of anger while I was still a student at Bob Jones. I'm so glad I still have it, because they're very strict as far as classes you go to, how often you show up. They had a demerit system.
Wow.
Where if you did something wrong, you got demerits, and you could only get a certain amount, you'd be kicked out. Anyways, so this one particular class, the ceramic class, I was late, 30 minutes late. And it was actually right when I moved in with my then boyfriend, and I didn't set my alarm. So I woke up, got there 30 minutes late. And the class was about 3 hours long. I mean, it's a lengthy class. So I got in, I did did whatever I was supposed to. And then the teacher spoke to me afterwards and said, I'm going to have to count this as an absence because you were 30 minutes late. I was like, oh, please, I'll stay 30 minutes longer. I'll clean, I'll do whatever. And the reason I panicked, because that could risk me completing that class, getting a grade, and me not graduating, which was a month away. So I begged with the teacher. I was just like, can I please make it up somehow? And she was a grad teacher, so she wasn't really like on permanent staff. And she was like, out of my convictions, I can't lie. I'm like, I'm not asking you to lie. I'm just asking if I can make it up somehow, those 30 minutes.
Right.
You were late. And I was like, yeah, I just moved my alarm. Like, I actually had a valid reason.
Right.
And I actually was still in my pajamas. So like, I showed up just like disheveled.
Right.
I have my convictions. I can't do that. You'll have to take that up with, higher authorities. And I was like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me?
Right.
And I mean, it was just weeks till I could actually graduate from this fucking institution.
Right.
So anyways, fast forward a couple weeks, I do meet with one of the deans over the education to talk about this 30 minutes late, technically it being an absence, whatever. And you have to be there. It's this, wood paneled room. This guy who's very Trump-esque. And he's in this black leather tufted desk chair. And
Oh, dude.
Situation, like 30 minutes late. And I'll never forget some of the stuff
Hold
he
on.
said to me.
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Yeah.
I think this one was on my end. You cut out when you said that he was in a black leather chair, and then what?
Oh, black leather tufted chair. And he asked me if I deserved grace for this absence. And so I just was really confused by that. And I was like, what is he meaning by that? Is this some sort of a trick question?
Right.
And then he went on to just say, we don't deserve. We don't deserve really anything in this world, kind of that sin narrative.
Yes.
And we're just, worms.
Of course.
And did I deserve grace in this instance? And I was just like so puzzled. And next week and tell me what your decision is. And so I remember leaving, went away, and I was like, what is he even talking about? I need to graduate. I will do whatever I need to get out of this school and be finished. Right. So I go back about a week later, and he's still in that, that chair, his throne. And he's like, what conclusion did you come to? And I was like, well, I wish I was a little smarter then, but I did say, well, I do believe in Jesus. And I think I'm good.
Right.
And he was just like, so you're saying you deserve grace when we as humans don't deserve any kind of grace? And I was like, I don't know what he's saying. So I was just like, yeah, I do deserve grace. And then he asked me to leave. So I left. And I mean, I graduated. I was able to walk across the stage. They even asked me to share a testimony at my graduation. Anyways, but my rage about that situation, I went and made this mug. So this mug has kind of followed me throughout. And recently I was in a horrible car accident about 2 years ago, and this mug survived. It was actually in my car. It was the only thing in my car that survived because I was moving, so I had furniture and stuff in my car. And this was in a bicycle helmet, protected. And I remember pulling it out from the wreck and be like, gosh, this damn mug is still intact.
Right.
But this all kind of represents where I am now. And at that moment when that happened, with the whole discussion about grace and how he approached it, I was like, I'm fucking done with this shit. And I'm going to have to figure this out on my own, because there is no support. I don't like this theology. It doesn't make sense.
Right.
And so from that point, I just decided, okay, I'm kind of on my own.
Yeah.
And that's when I started slowly coming out to friends, and really lost a community, family and friends, really lost an entire community. And I think that's good to bring that awareness into this space, where that's why some people stay closeted, or they just stay very private about if they're possibly LGBTQ. Right. But I would even argue that heterosexuals still have a form of coming out to do. We all do. But for me in particular, I was scared to do it. When I finally did it, understandably, I lost a lot.
Yeah, a lot of people in the circles that we're in have lost their faith communities for various reasons. And some of them are more traumatic than others, no doubt about it. I would certainly not compare me losing my community to how you lost your community, because the reasons were different, but I still lost people. And it's very painful to lose people that you think you're going to be with, doing life with, so to speak, right? For the rest of your life, people that you thought you were really close friends of yours, people that you thought you could trust. And when I came out and this wasn't even, at the time, I wasn't even fully bluntly, yes, I am queer inclusive. It was more, we can make a case for it. We should at least have that community allowed to worship despite our theological differences, even having that level of advocating for the queer community, which really at the time isn't a ton, but it's something. My pastor pretty much said, no, you're just too far gone. We can't worship with you if you're going to keep espousing these beliefs publicly. And again, I was really trying to play the hey, despite theological differences, can we still agree that we're all made in the Imago Dei? I was really trying to appeal to the humanity, right? And a lot of us, including myself, we lost so much. So I really resonate with that. I think what unites a lot of people who are maybe in the deconstructing community, and I don't like that word, but we can use it for sake of our conversation, is that we have lost something, or there's some level of intense, some form of hurt or trauma attached to our upbringing. And I think it's interesting how you kind of mentioned how really the theology of total depravity played a part in that, because that's what you're talking about, right? The idea that humans are garbage, we're shit, we are worms, there's nothing good in us, only God can make us good. And then you have this dean of, Rob Jones, really being so dehumanizing to you? Do you think you deserve grace? Well, okay, maybe I
Yeah.
don't deserve it, but isn't the point of Christ like he bestows it to us? So can you please reflect
Mhm.
that to me? I mean, it's not a hard connection to make, but it's interesting to hear you say that.
Yeah, and it's a very powerful rhetoric that really can control people. That's why it's
Mm,
here.
yeah, yeah. So
And
okay,
yeah.
so you graduate. When did
Mhm.
you start getting interested in therapy and in becoming this kind of person to help other people in this way?
Yeah, it was probably about 3 or 4 years ago. I
Okay.
came to kind of a crossroads in my life where I was needing some support. I was looking for a therapist.
Yeah.
I was dealing with some family issues, some past trauma, especially coming from the conversion therapy camps and
Mm,
these unexplained, emotions and triggers. And I was like, I don't know what this is. I don't know what to do. So I remember in the Greenville area, there were at that time, I think it's changed recently, there were no really LGBTQ affirmative therapists
wow.
or that identified on that spectrum and was a
Yes.
therapist.
Yeah.
So there was no mirroring, no nothing for me. So I did find a therapist and it was fine. It helped me through some hurdles, but I remember thinking like, why do we not exist?
Mm,
So I started seeing we do exist, but in more of the larger cities, Los Angeles, New York. And so the goal was to like, I'm just going to leave everything behind. I'm going to become this healer because I'm just going to become what I didn't have. Because
right.
there's so many people I knew of in my world in Greenville that didn't have this. So
Right.
that's when I found an LGBTQ affirmative therapy specialization at a school in Los Angeles. It's one of the only schools in the nation that has that. So
Mm,
that's what drew me out west, was
mm.
in search of answers, really, in search of a new beginning.
Wow, that's great. And regarding your faith journey, I mean, where do you see yourself now with your relationship to Christianity in general? Have you found different doors to explore? Or are you just kind of like, you know
Hmm.
what, the Christian faith for me, I'm just leaving the whole thing behind, the Jesus thing, the Bible thing, like I'm not interested. Where do you kind of land on that?
Yeah, it's so funny because the word deconstruction, kind of a buzzword right now.
Yeah.
For me, there was no really, it was just I blew the house up, done. So at that kind
Yeah.
of pivotal moment where I was talking about the mug and everything, I was just like, I'm
Right.
done. So I
Ah,
didn't step foot in any churches for a while, but
yeah.
just certain things in my life happened later in life where um, there was just mystery. It was mysterious, and there was
Yes.
no explanation for it.
Yeah.
So it kind of brought me back full circle to, I would say, more of a mystic
Yeah.
type teaching. Like I was really drawn to, or am really drawn to Richard Rohr's
Yes, of
writings
course.
and some
I
other
saw that
mystics
one
and stuff.
coming when you started saying the
Yeah,
word mystic.
yeah, it makes sense in my mind,
Sure,
and
sure.
it helped kind of break down historical elements to where we are today, especially with fundamentalism, and
Yes.
just rocked my world,
Yeah.
how our culture is framed by all this historical stuff. And now that's finally kind of being published.
Yeah.
It's always been there, but there
Yeah.
is more awareness towards it. And I
Yeah.
think that's a really good thing. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
That
more
makes a
in
lot of
that kind
sense.
of, yeah,
Yeah.
philosophy. Mhm.
I found the term deconstruction, and you even wrote this down in some of your notes for me ahead of time. It's kind of a buzzword. We know that. And it's also a very broad term. Some people do, they blow the house up. They have no interest in revisiting any of those pieces. I totally get it. I think a lot of us are over the idea of gatekeeping. Like, okay, no problem. Your journey is your journey.
Yeah.
But I do find though, that most people we engage with on New Evangelicals are still interested in some sort of divine,
Mhm.
usually something about the person of Jesus and this life that he lived that's told in the gospels is intriguing and beautiful and mystifying. And I find
Mhm.
that a lot of people are still drawn to this, and people like Richard Rohr, among other, liberation theology, queer theology, etc., has really it's helped me especially, or I should say in particularly, understand that the Christian tradition is way bigger than the basement of evangelicalism and fundamentalism, right? And I think a
Mhm.
lot of us were taught this is all there is. Like, to be a Christian is to have this view of the atonement, this view of the Bible,
Right.
this view of whatever else. And a lot of us are like, well, thankfully, due to the internet, I'm exposed to more voices than ever who actually are kind of helping me salvage my faith and reclaiming the beauty of what faith could look like going forward. Is that kind of like similar to what you've seen as well in your own journey?
Gosh, yeah, yeah, in my own journey, but also looking into the deconstruction movement.
Yeah.
Um, you know, that it's kind of, for me, it's interesting. It's kind of been like watching a football game from home, where there's the deconstruction team and all of its various leaders and people that I follow on Instagram and I'm very familiar with, you know, versus those, you know, the Christian team, and they're just going at it. And I'm like the spectator watching TV, and I'm like, why?
Right.
So then it's like, but then, you know, even preparing for this podcast and stuff, I'm like, why don't I go and watch some of the practices? I need to get a little bit more familiar with this. So I'm down there and I'm watching the coach and I'm watching the players, and I'm sitting here and I'm like, Rohr kind of was onto something when he said the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. And why are we in this arena, you know, hitting each other out of anger? Why aren't these deconstruction leaders, or those who are the leaders, doing something different? Let's not be in the arena anymore. Let's actually do something completely different. Let's spread out. Let's be more activists. Let's do this. From what I'm seeing from the outside in, there's this, there's a football game. And there's touchdowns, and we're trying to score points. We're trying to outdo them. And I'm worried in this movement that we will become little oppressors too.
Yes. I often say with our community that we don't want to become fundamentalists all over again. Right. Like it's easy to become a fundamentalist all over again. It would just with different language, different perspectives, and wanting to kind of repeat the cycle of chaos that we've come out of. Right. And it's tough because on one sense, for new evangelicals, part of what we do is we do believe in holding the church accountable. Right. We do believe in saying, hey, Evangelical Church, you got problems, and that's my mother. They birthed me, right? And I want to make it better. And I believe that the Evangelical Church could do a lot of good things, and has in the past before really Christian nationalism took over. So in that sense, it's like, okay, I'm kind of playing the game a little bit. But in the other sense, I agree with you a ton, Justin, where I think to myself often, like, how do we not repeat evangelicalism? You know, like, how do we carve better paths forward that are faithful faith communities, faithful to Jesus, embracing the mystery, non-oppressive, etc. And I think a lot of people are in this space where, because it's so fresh, right? For a lot of us, this is like we're breathing oxygen for the first time. We're kind of getting all of it out. We're kind of getting, okay, I can vent and not be judged. Great. Here's all my shit, you know, and here's the shit that happened to me. And I think in the next few years, as people kind of go through the process, and I would love your insight if you think that this might be a thing or not. I think people, as they start getting out some event and get some of their anger out and are starting to be heard, they might start then asking, okay, well, what's next? Obviously, no one wants to stay angry forever, but how do we start building new communities that are faithful and beautiful and not oppressive, etc.? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes. Well, trauma not transformed is transmitted.
Oh, powerful.
So you're going to find people, and I see it in this movement and the leaders, they're angry as fuck. And I get it. Like, I get it. And they're starting their own podcast. They're putting it on Instagram, you know, fine. It's not going to be transformative. So my kind of notion coming in is like, hey, I'm a therapist, I'm a healer. And I really think these people who are possibly leading it or not, just on their deconstruction journey, need to go to therapy. They need to find a safe space to work out this anger, to work out this resentment, to work out the trauma. And once they can transform it, they can find healing from that. I think they can go out and be better activists and better transformers.
That makes a lot of sense. It's funny you say that because I'm in therapy for what happened at my church for losing my faith community. And I'm not naturally a very angry person. I'm really not. I'm just not how I'm wired. I'm very angry over what happened to me a few months ago. Like, I'm pretty bitter and livid over it. And I told myself, you need to get therapy because you have you've created this platform and you're kind of the face of it right now, just because of the nature of the beast of social media. And your anger could turn into bitterness real quick, and then it's a problem, right? Like, I think anger can be a healthy fuel, or it can really wreck you. And I was in therapy a couple of weeks ago, and I'm just venting. I'm getting it all out in this safe space. And at the end of it, my wife overheard some of it. She goes, "You said fuck a lot." I'm like, I know, because I'm so fucking angry. You know? I was like, I had to get it out. And better there between me and someone else privately than me saying all those words publicly, just because those words weren't meant to be heard publicly, right? I'm not looking for scrutiny. It's just raw emotion coming out. So I think you're onto something where people who even if they didn't mean to, who have influence in platforms and are claiming to be someone speaking on behalf of some kind of movement, owe it to themselves, and I am one of these people, to make sure that we're doing our best to be healthy, right? To help carve new paths forward, to also create safe spaces for others who maybe don't have access to those things.
Totally. And you're onto it. And if they can do that individual work, they can better help people that are on the same journey instead of staying in this same cycle, this same system.
Right. Because evangelicalism feeds off of anger and rage. I mean, especially white evangelicalism, right? I mean, we know the playbook. I grew up in it. You've been a part of it. They feed off of scare tactics, boogeyman tactics, and anger. And
I don't football game analogy.
Yes. And I don't want to play that game forever, right? Certainly there are moments to call it out, but having a nonstop life of just consuming and responding, there's got to be better ways to live.
Oh, totally. And I mean, that's their arena. They're ready for it. You know, they've got a one up on us because they're waiting for the second coming, and they've got a second life that they get to do whatever. I mean, you know, they can use whatever to kind of tactics. We'll call them touchdowns, when realistically it's just not valid. And we need to be in a completely different place. We don't need to play by their rules, by their game. Let's take this to a way better plane of transcendence. And I'm not seeing that happen yet. And that's okay, because we need to probably get some of the anger out. But again, let's do it on an individual journey. Let's do it in some sort of therapy. And I would love to talk about like what is good therapy, like a safe place for people to go to, because psychology itself can also be oppressive. So we have to kind of know how to move about this.
Yes, I want to move into that. I have one more question that I think will lead us there. So I don't know how to ask this question, so if I overspeak, forgive me, but I'm going to try and get it out so you understand. We live in a very individualistic society, right? Where everything is the individual. How do I get therapy? How do I get help? That's obviously needed and important. I get that. But as far as a group collectively going through something, right? There are, just like how there are patterns in the grieving process for the individual, I think that there are grieving processes for the collective, right? So where, and I'm not sure if you can answer this, but if you can, your best guess, where do you think collectively, as a, for lack of a better term, deconstruction movement, do you think we are in the traumatic, or I guess the healing process of recognizing trauma and starting to heal from it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. There's so many avenues for this, but I think, people need to have a little bit. I agree. The problem is an individualistic culture. That is a big problem. But to agree, we have to also differentiate and have our own healing personally. But I think there also needs to be spaces that are open enough for people to collectively share their healing journeys, and what can we do about it? We got to get out of the football field. We got to actually be starting these spaces and these groups, not for ego, because I'm seeing that a little bit too, or for some sort of situation like that, but for just pure love and acceptance and healing. And so kind of that journey. And to kind of go into that too, a little plot twist is actually looking at sex therapy in our sex lives. I think sex in this community, coming from the evangelical world, what I'm noticing in therapy and what I'm doing in my own studying, and I'm studying to become a sex therapist, is sex seems to be a crucial gateway to an authentic part of ourselves. It's our sexuality can speak and reflect some of the most honest and vulnerable parts of our being. And from that culture, that has been very neglected and it's been controlled. So I want to bring that element into some sort of a sexual liberation. I think can also be a huge key in our healing and also understanding ourselves more as a collective.
Okay, let's park there for a few minutes, because now we're in the realm of therapy. You mentioned sex therapy. A lot of, I shouldn't say I always say that, our community, because there's 16 people who help run this thing. it's mainly women who engage with us on Instagram. It's 70% female,
Oh,
or people. Yeah.
interesting.
And that actually is pretty common for a lot of these larger deconstruction type accounts. And every couple months we do, the way our account works is we'll ask questions, people share anonymously, we screenshot, we share in the stories. Gives people just a way to kind of vent, and they can be heard without being known in that way. It's kind of a safe spot for them. Every couple months we do one on purity culture, and we do it intentionally every couple months because it really has messed people up, and it's really affected women in a very specific way. And it's important that they have a way to kind of vent some of that stuff. So dig into this for me. Unpack this idea of sex therapy and also sexual liberation. When you say that, what does that mean? Does that mean, oh, sleep with whoever you want? It doesn't, there is no ethics to sex anymore? Or are you trying to say something different? Like, how do you unpack that?
Gosh, we could talk for hours on this, but
well, you brought it up, right?
yeah. Purity culture in general, it needs to be less reactive and move to a more robust view of sexuality. Now that goes into more of a cultural narrative where we don't have good sex education whatsoever, and the only sex education really out there is heterosexual. I mean, just for straight people,
right?
So there's nothing really for LGBTQ people. We've had to find it through various avenues, porn, or on the school bus talking to someone or whatever. Like there was no mirroring or no outlet for that.
Right.
So
that makes sense.
As a culture, we are so immature sexually. So I think that needs, with a good sex therapist, some people can dive into more avenues of that, because I think sex and that sexual energy isn't just for the act of sex. It actually can seep out into more of a spirit of love, a spirit of just pleasure, different various pleasures in our life, and intimacy.
I'm going to be honest with you. I'm a little, I don't use the word triggered, but it's like, you said some things that make me a little uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Like pleasure, sex that isn't necessarily actively sex, but like comes out in the form of love. What does that mean? Because again, like many of us, I'm a product of purity culture, and my wife and I we're very open about our sex life with each other. We don't have any boundaries there, which I'm grateful for. I know some people have those boundaries, but we're talking about what this means for us to have different boundaries than what purity culture has given us. For you, when you say sexual liberation, are you referring to just like, can you unpack sexual liberation a little bit more for us, like for the community who's listening to you? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's a historical context to it, but I guess to bring it in now would be it's basically just trying to deepen an intimacy within yourself, but also being more open to various sexual identities. And what is sex, what is measured as healthy sex, and then looking at the education system. But also, I mean, statistically, there's heterosexuals that probably are the majority of the culture, or a majority of the planet, but statistically half of that maybe is heterosexual is actually bisexual. And that comes back to the Kinsey that I was talking about earlier, the scale. There's half of your audience, let's just say half of your audience is most likely on that bisexual spectrum. Now, it's hard to measure because there's a lot of people who are probably still have some shame around that. Aren't very comfortable sharing it. So it is sometimes hard to measure, but there's a majority of people, at least half, that are attracted to both genders. So, and then there's the a little part of that is LGBTQ or LGTQ. So what I'm trying to say is we're all on this spectrum, and not many people are very open to exploring different things sexually because of the negative attitudes towards sex and the negative attitudes towards LGBTQ people.
Right. And I think part of the reason, at least for me and maybe for the audience, could be because I've been taught my whole life that the Bible is the final authority on almost anything moral. Now that I'm thinking beyond that, in the sense of, I still find the Bible to be full of wisdom when taken in its context, but as far as it being primarily a rule book, I don't see it that way so much anymore. But then what that does is it leaves a gap, right? Because it's like, well, then what is my new source of what is right and what is wrong? In this case, sexually, right? Like, what are my new boundaries? Is it just as long as it's consensual? Is that the only boundary? Is there any ethic to sex anymore? How do I teach my son as he grows up, responsible, healthy sexuality that allows him to make decisions, but also gives him some kind of framework, right? Because I think
Yeah,
sex still
yeah.
I do believe as I would identify as a follower of Jesus, that there still is a spiritual and sacred aspect to sex in general. How do we handle that responsibly while
Mm.
not dehumanizing just to a physical feeling? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And when you bring in that moral and then that sexual and blend it together, that to me is healthy sexuality. So
Mm,
consensual, yes. Safe,
mm,
safe sex, you know, protection, whatever you both agree upon is safe for you.
yeah.
That comes with more of being, you know, consensual, but making sex the focus of the act of sex pleasure and fun centered,
Mm,
not penetration centered, not
mm,
orgasm centered,
mm,
pleasure and fun.
mm.
And that is hard for a lot of people from our various backgrounds to actually lean into.
Yeah, I
Why
mean,
should I
sorry for
have
me.
pleasure and fun? I'm, you know, I'm scum of the earth.
Right. Right. And also changing your definition. Like, a lot of men probably feel like if they don't have an orgasm, was it actually sex?
Oh
Right.
yeah,
Like
that's
how,
where erectile dysfunction comes in. And
right.
I changed the narrative on that. It's erectile disappointment. It's
I
not
like
always going
that.
to work. It's not always going to work the same. And that's natural and fine. We didn't learn that in sex education. People go and
No.
take Viagra, or they go to porn and be like, why can't I perform like that dude? Well, he's
Right.
on 3 Viagras. That's how he can perform for hours.
Right.
That's not natural. But
Right.
there's no talk about this.
I think that's really a huge thing that needs to be destigmatized. Along with, I was under the assumption because my wife and I we did things quote unquote right. We waited for marriage, right? And you just assume
Mm,
because of how purity culture teaches you that as a man, I'm always going to want sex at any moment. I'll leave this conversation right now and go have sex, kind of thing. And my wife, I think maybe sometimes. And then as we got into our
mm.
marriage and got into our rhythms, I had a lot of moments where I just wasn't in the mood. I thought, oh my God, is something wrong with me? Like, maybe I'm not performing like how I want to, or whatever it is, right? Is something wrong with me? This isn't working properly because I had no
Mhm.
context for what is just a normal human experience where you're just not always in the mood to have sex. And that's normal.
It is, and it fluctuates. It's also fluid. There's going to be months where it's hyperactive. There's going to be months where it's not. There's going to be times when you're feeling it, and that is all okay.
Yeah. That's very reassuring, honestly. I think for the audience, it's probably reassuring too, because again, just what
Yes.
we were taught between that and a diet of pornography in our culture, you don't know what's real. Like
Yeah.
is that person at in the kitchen just in the mood automatically because that's what porn teaches me, or can this guy go for hours,
Right.
and never
Hmm.
never lose his erection? Because if that's the case, I'm a failure. Like just things like that.
Yeah.
You know.
Totally. Which brings in like we need more porn literacy.
Hmm.
That's not
Interesting.
even ever addressed either. But where people can see the realities of this, where porn can actually benefit your sex life and where it doesn't, where you
Hmm.
don't need it, and
Interesting.
what are some good ethical porns to watch, like feminist porn.
Hmm. What is
That
that?
sometimes is feminist porn. It's great. Like I sometimes prescribe it for clients where it's not this guy walking in the office and throwing his secretary over the desk. It's
Yes.
it's consensual.
Hmm.
It's playful. It's erotic, and
Hmm.
it's a mutual coming together, and
Hmm.
it plays out beautifully. So there's even some more ethical avenues for that for people to look into.
I really wonder at this moment how uncomfortable my audience is at this point in the conversation.
That's good. They need to lean into it.
I mean,
Lean
hey, they
into it.
listen to the podcast and they know they're always here for something different. And I think if the audience is listening and maybe someone's out there like this is too far for me, we're not asking you that you have to agree with Justin or with myself. We're just asking you to acknowledge that there are a wide variety of ways to view these things. You should at least be aware of how people are looking at some of these conversations. Whether you agree or not, it's a different conversation than what is out there and how some people are approaching this for their own healing journey, which is very important. So I want to put that out there as a disclaimer, because whenever we talk about sex, especially pornography, I think a lot of people can just,
Mm,
again, it can be a trauma response, right? Just from how we were growing
totally.
up with it or what we were taught about it, being exposed to it at a really early age and how it really affected us. So there's a lot in that realm that we can't unpack here for the conversation. But I do
Right.
appreciate you, Justin, kind of hitting on that.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
take
go
these
ahead.
triggers to a sex therapist.
I love that. That's really good.
Take it, work it out.
Do you have some more time? Can you hang out for a few more minutes?
Yeah, let's
All right,
go.
great. I want to talk about this idea that therapy can be oppressive. I want to circle back to that because that one really kind of made me go,
Hmm.
we got to talk about this before our time is
Hmm.
up. Can you unpack that? What does that mean that therapy can be oppressive?
Gosh. Well, therapy or psychology was created by two cisgendered white men. So let's acknowledge that, Freud and
Mm,
Jung.
mhm.
And a lot of times when it comes different therapists and how it depends on a lot of how they're trained too. We can try to mold someone that's in front of us for them to blend in with various systems of oppression.
Ah,
So we have to be really informed on everything, that we're not forcing a client to lean into a certain direction that actually is hurting them.
hmm,
So for example, there's a lot of Instagram influencers out there that are showing their body to everyone, which is fine and great. But they'll come into the therapy office and they're having sex problems. And so, as you dig into it, you're like, I wonder why that's happening.
hmm,
Well, they're trying to become something they're not, and
hmm.
their sexuality, or let's just say they're cisgendered male, they're not able to have sex the way they want to,
Right.
because they are putting an identity out there in the world that they have to stay with, and they think that
Ah,
is getting them some sort of attention, credibility. Um, and it's actually hurting them. It's actually
hmm,
hurting their mental health and actually helping.
hmm.
So in a sense, some therapists may not ever pick up on that. They're just like, do your thing, go take some pills. I'll get you a
Right.
psychiatrist. No, actually what he's doing in his life is actually harming him.
Hmm.
So we just have to be really aware of just even little minute things like that. And especially when, as a white cisgendered male, if I have a client that's a person of color, their struggle and their life is very different from mine. So to even
Right.
be aware of that and be like, why can't you get a job?
You're right.
Why
Right.
aren't you documented?
Right. Right. Yeah. Hmm.
So just being keenly aware of that in sex, because there's a lot of therapists that are more sex negative
Hmm.
and are trained kind of more that way. So if you talk with them about sex, they're not really probably going to be very encouraging of you experimenting sexually, or being more fluid in your sexuality.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
you want to be in a space where you can be really open about everything.
Yeah, that's really
Just put it
helpful.
on the table. Yeah.
I like that. Before we get ready to wrap up here, you mentioned before we recorded the concept of trying to find a good therapist. What that looks like.
Mhm.
I think that's a big struggle for people in the deconstruction community for a lot of reasons. It could be economical, right? It could just be, hey, I don't have the money for a therapy. My insurance doesn't cover it. It could be, how do I even look for someone who understands evangelical culture, who also isn't going to tell me to read my Bible and pray more, right? Like,
Yeah.
so what are some of your tips and your suggestions for people out there who are looking for just someone to help guide them through via therapy? And also, could you separate for me at some point in this conversation a therapist versus a counselor versus like a coach, and how those are separate things? Does that make sense? Because
Yes.
I hear these terms intertwined a lot, and I don't think they're all the same. That's
Yeah, they're
important.
not.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're
Okay.
not. I'm glad you brought that up. As far as a therapist, like Psychology Today is a really wonderful resource where you can even type in the area you live in and various modalities they might use, like methods, like if they're trauma informed, um, that kind of a thing, or PTSD or whatever. So that's a good resource. But for a good therapist, you want someone who is trauma informed, especially within this community. They know what
Mm,
trauma looks like, they know how it affects your nervous system and how it affects your overall health. And also, I really encourage friends that go into therapy too, just to get someone who's sex positive. And typically therapists will have that on their various profiles,
mm,
that they're sex positive, they're not sex negative. So look at that, because you want someone who can hold a container with everything that you might feel is uncomfortable, especially coming from an evangelical or fundamental background. It's going to be hard for you to talk about it. So you want a
right.
therapist who can sit there and hear you and help, tie things together for you that you may not be educated on.
Mm,
So that's why I encourage sex therapy too. And you can search sex therapists. But within that, you have to be careful. And this is, of course, just my opinion, not to find someone who says they're a sex therapist, but they have CSAT beside their name, CSAT. That is a certified sex addiction therapist.
hmm.
So I come from more of the camp of, it's not a thing. Sex addiction isn't a thing. We can talk about that some other time, but that tends to be more of a sex negative response for people that are in various walks of life. So you want to avoid that, especially if you're wanting to talk more about your personal sex life. You don't want someone coming in thinking, I viewed porn today. Oh, you must have an addiction. No, that's not the case. So it tends to be more sex phobic. So a licensed sex therapist, usually they're from ASECT, is a governing body of sex therapists here in America. And someone who can do more narrative work. And narrative therapy is fairly new. It originated in New Zealand and Australia, but it's people who can help people like us from our background kind of change the narrative. They use different words and phrases, or let's look at it this way.
Yeah.
And that can be really beneficial for people who have trauma, especially from religious circles.
Okay. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why don't we unpack, therapist versus coach versus counselor? What are some of the differences there, and what should people look for, depending on what they're looking to have, or what I should say, what should people look for in regards to what kind of help they're looking for with each of those?
Counselors, within the framework I did through psychology, through marriage and family therapist, clinical psychology, you get a lot of training, learning the history and the various modalities, especially around addiction. You get a lot of training, and those that take more of the counseling, I'm not so sure they get as much training around that. And a lot of counselors are typically more faith-based.
Yes.
So I would say avoid that, to be honest, because you could be talking about some trauma that occurred with an uncle or childhood trauma and how it's affecting you. And they might ask you at the end, how's your walk with Christ? And that's just going to spiral you. So just be cautious with some of that. Coaches, it's kind of more of a self-made. They probably study on their own. There's various certifications you can get from coaching where you just kind of pay a fee, and it's more or less they kind of direct you through how to talk to people. But it's not really any kind of intense grad school training.
Okay.
So a lot of the things they say is just stuff either they've learned on their own personal walk, which can be informative and great, but it's not necessarily the best.
Yeah. In my experiences, coaching is more like, hey, let me help develop you as a person. Like, here's some disciplines that you might want to get into. Here's how you say more, almost like life coaching, really, which is more of self-development as far as not really dealing with maybe trauma, but more of like, let's get your habits in shape. Make sure you're reading more, whatever it is. It seems like it's kind of its own realm, even though I think people kind of conflate all of these terms in their head and like, oh, anything that must be helpful, whether it's coaching, counseling, or therapy, they're just all the same training. And I feel like, obviously, and this, it's not, and that's important to recognize, right?
Yeah. And a lot of coaching too, is around financial wealth too.
Yes.
Like, how can I get my business more successful and stuff like that.
Right.
So they're not going to be able to help you with your emotions. Yeah.
The counseling comment that you made, I think is really accurate. When I went through it's called, my wife calls it Saturn's return. It's like a moment in your life when, Saturn comes full circle and you had like this like midlife crisis at like 28. Well, I went through that and, had major panic and anxiety. And it was just like a light switch, just out of nowhere, just full fight or flight mode. I lost like 30 pounds in a month. I was just losing my mind, I felt like. And that was the beginning of me getting into therapy. It started with a Christian counselor. And honestly, he was a great guy. He was super helpful. And I appreciated him. But there was a point where I said to myself, I need something a little more clinical, right? Like, I need someone who can actually tell me, nope, this is what's happening psychologically. Here's some things we should start working through. And I did. I found this secular therapist, and honestly, it absolutely saved my mental health for sure. And that was one of the moments. It was another moment in my life where I said, maybe like Christian everything isn't always the best, right? You just assume, oh, this is a Christian counselor, they must be the best. But a lot of times in this realm, it's kind of the opposite. And it's not even intentional, right? I don't think my counselor was trying to mislead me or trying to harm me. He was just repeating what he knew and what he was trained based on his faith-based training.
Gosh, yeah. And psychotherapists, with our training, it's our job to know human nature better than anyone. So that's why I really want to encourage that. And if you're getting everything from the Bible, especially sexual education, you're going to get nowhere. I mean, the people that wrote it at those various times in history had no sexology.
Right.
or knowing anything about sexual identity.
Right.
So you're
It
not
didn't
going to get
exist.
anything.
It wasn't the thing.
It just, yeah.
We can thank Freud, I
So,
think, for our sexual identity issues.
gosh, yeah, for real. And Freud himself was actually more or less bisexual.
Huh. Interesting. Did not know that.
So was Abraham Lincoln. So
What?
was George Washington.
Stop
Yeah.
it. You're blowing all
Yeah.
my categories.
Abraham Lincoln had bedmates.
You are joking.
No, see, this stuff isn't talked about.
No, of course not. Because you know why? If you say that, what are you told? Oh, it's the gay agenda coming for your kids. Look, they're sexualizing everything.
Yeah.
It's what
The whole kid
happens,
rhetoric
Justin.
is so weird.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's terrible. It's terrible.
Well, it's their way of kind of getting people to really not like you.
Yeah, seriously. And again, scared, right? It's a scare tactic. Oh, don't look at that. It's going to harm you. In reality, purity culture is at some points, unfortunately, killing people. And I'm sure you know the statistic. I'm not sure if you know who Bridget Eileen Rivera is. She wrote the book Heavy Burdens.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great book. And she points out in the book that statistically speaking, the queer community is at a higher risk of suicide if they attend a church. They're the only group in America to be at a higher risk if they attend a faith-based church. And it makes sense when you hear this kind of stuff. It's crazy.
It does. And, I still have family members, and my fiance has family members that still will quote scripture just, because it's part of their everyday life. And I'm like, they don't understand how harmful that actually is. Totally. And to able to reach LGBTQ people that left the church, scripture isn't going to do it for you.
No, you're totally right.
It's not. It's going to push them away.
You're on the money. I completely agree with you on that. I mean, the church has, I can't even just, better than I do how much they've completely not just dropped the ball, but have dehumanized the queer community for decades, whether it's the AIDS crisis all the way through. It's shameful. And the church has not repented, and they need to, because they are directly responsible for many deaths, unfortunately.
Oh, totally. And today, and I've worked with LGBTQ homeless, and these kids kicked out.
Wow.
Completely disowned and kicked out from their parents. And in every instance, it's some sort of, it could be Mormon, it could be Catholic, it could be fundamental. Completely.
So how do you stay out of the football field then? If you see this, and I'm sure it makes you angry, how do you as Justin, how do you not just lose your shit every day ranting at the Evangelical Church for the harm they're causing to the queer community? Like, how do you do it?
I do it full time. I am what I am. I'm a psychotherapist serving this community. I've made it my career, my vocation. Yeah. This is my way. And even talking with you, this is my way to be an activist. This is my activism.
Yeah.
It's to change this narrative. It's for you to hear from more queer people how we feel, what we're doing, and what our thoughts are. Yeah. And I really think it's going to be queer voices that heal this world. And I've said to friends and family members, LGBTQ people historically have been, ancient times have been the spiritual leaders. They were the shamans. And I really think if we're going to turn this around, even within a church structure, I got to say it needs to be led by LGBTQ people. We have an innate spiritual gift in our DNA to channel this and to heal.
I am hopeful, and it's not soon enough, but I am hopeful that in a few decades, the Evangelical Church looks back with disdain at how they treated the queer community. I'm hopeful of that. I think it is changing. It's not soon enough. It should have happened a long time ago. And I agree with you. I think that really minority voices need to lead, going forward. I just did, I'm not sure if this will be out by the time I release this other series, but I just did a 3-part series with Brian and Shay from Queer Theology. They're great humans, and we just did a 3-part series with them and unpacking their stories and also their theology. And Shay is a priest in the old Catholic tradition, and that was just mind-blowing to me hearing him talk about it. So I agree with you. The queer voices have been silenced, but they need to be heard. They offer beauty and insight into the divine that no one else can offer, and we should be learning from them, not dehumanizing them, right? So
yeah. And there's a reason they've been silenced.
Yeah.
It's we're not as controllable. We're more liberated in our everyday lives. And people from that side, they don't like it.
Yeah, that's good. Well, Justin, I appreciate you making time. I appreciate you coming on and talking about all these things. I loved that we push the conversation into some new territory for the podcast. We need that to happen. People need to be aware of perspectives that they're not listening to all the time. So hopefully this podcast helps do that. Where can people find you? Are you on Instagram? Like, do you do any social media work, etc.?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram. It's my name, Justin Oberste. And then they can email me too through my private practice. It's justin@justinoberste.com.
Great. Well, I'll make sure to put your Instagram handle in the show notes, and
Okay.
I'm sure we'll have this conversation again. I appreciate
I would
making
love to.
time. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.